Honors Algebra. You are now taking notes on 8.2 day 1, and you should have your notes in front of you and your Chromebooks, and you're going to start taking some notes. We're going to show you how to solve quadratic equations now by using the quadratic formula. So up until this point, you've learned 3 ways to solve quadratic equations, and that was to solve by factoring if you can, solve by using the square root method, solve by using the completing the square method to make it a perfect square trinomial. And now we're going to show you a method of using the quadratic formula. Now, in case you can't factor, you can always solve any quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. But what I want you to do right now is go ahead and do these warm-up problems and press pause until you're done, and then come back and check your answer. So hopefully if you checked your answer for problem I, you should have gotten 6 square root of 3i, because if we go ahead and break this down, we can't take the square root of a negative because now it becomes imaginary. The square root of negative 1 is I, so square root of 108 breaks down to square root of 36 times root 3, which is 6 root 3i. Here, if we simplify, we could just throw this in our calculator. What's underneath the radical, you have to be careful, especially with today, because we're going to be making sure you use these parentheses, because if you forget your parentheses, you're going to get the wrong answer. Anything squared is positive, so we should have gotten 16. And if you just scope really quick, we're going to have 2 negatives when multiplied, which means we're going to have a plus sign in between. So if you have, from this point on, an even number of negatives, you're going to have a positive. So we should get positive 24 all over 4. So we have 4 minus square root of 16 plus 24 is square root of 40 all over 4. And we get down to 2 root 10, but we're not done. So hopefully you didn't finalize your answer. Notice that we have we can reduce that, all 3 factors, all 3 terms by the outside. So we can actually reduce this to 2, to 1, and to 2. So our final answer for this warm-up problem is 2 minus 1 square root 10. We don't really need that 1 there. All over 2. Okay? So this is our final answer. All right. Now the quadratic formula. Okay. So the quadratic formula, it only helps and makes sense if you understand that a quadratic equation, again, recall, is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A, b, and c are real numbers. And that means our square term, and this is our linear term, and this is our constant, okay? And we're going to identify what those terms are, but first let's talk about the quadratic formula. So anytime you can't factor a quadratic equation, you can always use the quadratic formula to solve. So the quadratic formula says that to solve for x, that x is equal to the opposite of b. Please don't think it's negative, because if b is already negative, I don't want you to think you don't do anything. So it's the opposite of whatever your b value is, plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And that's your quadratic formula. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be doing some problems with examples now where we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve for a quadratic equation. The very first step of using the quadratic formula, we do need our quadratic equation in standard form, meaning ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if your equation is not set equal to 0, you have to get it equal to 0 first. Okay, identify your a term, your b term, and your c, your constant. Now you can do it like that, or you could write them on the side. I like to write them on the side myself because it's just a nice thing to view. And then all we're going to be doing is using this quadratic formula using these values, and that's it. So to solve for the quadratic equation, we're going to have two answers because our highest degree is 2. So we're going to use the opposite of our b value, which is -9, plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Now, honestly, since you have to memorize this formula by heart, I personally think it's better to write out the formula first every single time, because now by the time you go ahead and do your homework, you'll know it by heart by the time you're doing the 5th problem. And you have to know that by heart anyway. So I should have done this first for you to write out the formula, and after that we're going to substitute, pure substitution of our a, b, and c values wherever they need to go. So our b value is 9, our a is 2, our c term is -5, and then here I'm going to substitute in, instead of my a, I'm going to put 2 in place of a. So all I'm going to do is evaluate. So I'm going to take -9, or opposite of 9, well, which is -9, plus or minus. Now I know anytime I square anything, I'm going to get a positive. So nobody should ever, ever, ever be giving me a negative right here. So this is 81. If I scope this part out, I have 2 negatives. So right away I know this is going to be plus something. So I have 4 times 2 times 5, which is 40. And all over 4. So I'm sorry, that's kind of long. Probably shouldn't have done that. All right, so if I simplify that, I have -9 plus and minus the square root. Now, 80 plus 40 is 121 all over 4. So now I'm going to simplify this. This ends up being nice because the square root of 121 is 11. So I have -9 plus and minus 11 all over 4. So actually I have 2 answers for x. By the way, it's always x equals. So this entire, we're solving for x. So I have -9 plus 11. So -9 plus 11 divided by 4 is one answer, which is 2/4, which reduces to 1/2. There's one answer for x. And I have -9 minus 11 over 4, which is -20/4, which is equal to -5. So x equals -5 and x equals 1/2. Okay, so those are my 2 answers for my quadratic equation. And that's how it goes. So let's go ahead and do b first. If you look here, b is not in standard form, so we have to get it in standard form. So if we subtract 1 from each side, we're going to get 3x squared plus 4x minus 1 equals 0. And now that we have this in standard form, I'm going to identify my a, b, and c value. So doing that, my a is 3, my b term is +4, and my c term, always grab the sign in front, is -1. So again, to get used to writing the formula, you're going to say the opposite of b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So if we go ahead and purely substitute in those values, the opposite of b is -4 plus and minus b squared. Now, from this point, again, notice that here I use parentheses, and in the warm-up, if you look above, they use parentheses. You're going to want to get used to that because mistakes have been made every time you don't use parentheses. So we're going to purely substitute in, for my b value, I'm going to substitute in 4. For a, I'm going to substitute in 3. And for c, I'm going to substitute in -1. And for a, I'm going to substitute in 3. You can use your calculator at this point, or you could, this whole chapter, by the way, you can finally use your calculator. Okay, I know some of you are happy about that. So 4 squared, again, any number squared is positive. Scope this out. I have 2 negatives, so I know I'm going to have a positive. 4 times 3 times 1 is 12 all over 6. I really have to stop making my square roots very big. Okay. Now, if I go ahead and simplify that, I'm just going to drag that over here. That's an arrow. That's a sad arrow. Negative 4 plus and minus 16 plus 12 is 28 all over 6. I can simplify this radical. I have negative 4 plus and minus. Square root of 28 is square root of 4 times square root of 7, which is 2 root 7. So 2 root 7, 2 root 7 all over 6. But, again, we're not done, because if you look, I can actually reduce all 3 of those outside terms by a factor of 2. So if I reduce those by a factor of 2, I'm going to get negative 2 plus and minus 1 root 7, which is the same as root 7, all over, reduce this to factor of 3. Okay? So x equals negative 2 plus or minus root 7 over 3. Now, something I want to talk to you about how your book may state this. Your book may give the answers of, hey, I want you to separate them. So they may say, okay, each term separately, negative 2/3 plus root 7 over 3 as one answer, and then they may have negative 2/3